The night I decided to poison the entire family was the same night I realized I was never going to survive in that house. Not as a wife, not as a daughter-in-law, not even as a human being. I can still remember the way my hands shook as I crushed the bitter herbs into their evening stew, the way my heart pounded so loudly I thought the servants in the kitchen could hear it. I had been forced to marry my master's son only weeks before, paraded around like some kind of prize, and told to be grateful for the honor. So tell me, was I wrong for what I did? If you were trapped, powerless, and stripped of every choice you ever had, would you have done the same thing? I wasn't always this person. Before that house, before the wedding, before the poison, I was just a girl trying to survive. I was born on the plantation, raised to work in the fields, taught early that my body, my time, and my future didn't belong to me. My mother used to whisper stories to me at night about freedom, about running north, about a life where we could choose who we loved and where we lived. But she died when I was 14, fever taking her in the middle of summer, and with her went the last bit of softness in my world. After she passed, I was moved from the fields to the main house. They said it was because I was well-mannered and pleasant to look at. I knew what that meant. I scrubbed floors, washed linens, polished silver, and learned how to move silently through hallways filled with people who would never see me as anything more than property. The master of the house was a cold man, but it was his wife who truly terrified me. She had a way of smiling at you while saying the cruelest things, like she was amused by your existence. Their son, Edward, had just returned from university when I turned 18. He was older than me by nearly 10 years, educated, well-dressed, and bored. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me the first time he saw me carrying a tray into the dining room. I kept my gaze down, just like I'd been taught. But that didn't stop him. It started with small things. He'd call me into the study for no real reason, asking for tea he didn't drink or books he didn't read. He'd stand too close, brush his fingers against mine, ask me questions about my life as if it were some kind of exotic tale. I answered carefully, always aware that one wrong word could cost me everything. He liked to remind me that I was different from the others, that I was special. I knew better than to believe that. One evening, I overheard something that changed my life. I was outside the parlor doors, waiting to clear the glasses, when I heard Edward laughing with his father. "I've made up my mind," he said. "I want her." My stomach dropped. His father asked, amused, "The little house girl?" Edward replied, "Yes. Why not? It'll be good for her. Better than the fields." They spoke about me like I was livestock, like I had no ears, no heart, no fear. A week later, the mistress summoned me. She told me I had been chosen for a great honor. Her son had decided to take me as his wife. I stared at her, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. Slaves didn't marry into the master's family. But she explained it wasn't about love or equality. It was about control. If I became his wife, I would belong entirely to him. No risk of another man claiming me. No risk of me bearing children that weren't his. It would secure his legacy. I tried to protest. I told her I didn't want this. I said I wasn't worthy. She slapped me so hard my ears rang for hours. "You don't get to want," she said quietly. "You don't get to choose." The wedding was small, private. No celebration. No music. Just a preacher, the master, the mistress, and Edward standing beside me in a stiff black suit. I wore a plain white dress they had picked out, not for beauty, but for symbolism. I remember thinking how ironic it was that they cared about purity when they had stolen everything else from me. Edward held my hand during the ceremony, gripping it tightly enough to hurt. When the preacher pronounced us husband and wife, everyone smiled except me. That night, I learned what my new role truly meant. I won't go into details, but I will say this. Marriage did not make me safer. It did not make me equal. It only gave him legal and moral permission to do whatever he wanted. I lay there afterward staring at the ceiling, feeling like I had left my body. Something inside me cracked. The days that followed were worse than I imagined. The mistress treated me like a servant who had overstepped her place. She criticized the way I poured tea, the way I spoke, the way I walked. "You may carry our name now," she'd hiss, "but don't forget where you came from." Edward, on the other hand, treated me like a possession he had just purchased. He'd show me off to guests, making me stand beside him in the drawing room while they stared. Some were shocked. Others were amused. No one asked how I felt. The final straw came about a month into the marriage. I discovered I was pregnant. When I told Edward, he seemed pleased at first, but when his mother found out, her reaction was ice cold. She pulled me aside and whispered that if I gave birth to a child who looked too much like me, there would be consequences. I didn't need her to explain what that meant. That night, I sat alone in the small room. They allowed me to call mine, and realized something horrifying. My child, if I carried it to term, would be born into the same cage I had lived in my entire life. Owned, controlled, powerless, and I would have helped put them there. I began to think in ways I never had before. I started paying attention in the kitchen, to the herbs the cook used, to the remedies the older women whispered about. I remembered stories my mother told me about plants that could heal and plants that could harm. I didn't act on those thoughts right away. At first, they terrified me. I was not a violent person. I didn't want blood on my hands. But the house grew more suffocating each day. Edward became more possessive, more unpredictable. The mistress watched me like a hawk. The master barely acknowledged my existence unless it was to remind me of my place. I realized there was no future here for me. No escape. They would never let me leave, especially not with a child carrying their blood. So that's the situation I was in. Trapped in a marriage I never wanted. Carrying a child who would be born into bondage. Living under the same roof as the people who saw me as nothing more than a tool. Before I tell you what I did next, I want you to pause and think. If you were me, with no law to protect you, no family left, no safe place to run, what would you have done? Would you have endured it and hoped for mercy? Or would you have risked everything for one chance at freedom? The decision came quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fueled by rage in the moment. It was slow and deliberate. I began collecting small amounts of certain herbs from the garden and the storage room. Nothing that would raise suspicion. I ground them into fine powders and hid them in a small cloth pouch beneath a loose floorboard in my room. My hands shook the first time I prepared them, not because I doubted what they could do, but because I knew there would be no turning back. I chose a night when the entire family would be present for dinner. The master had invited a business associate earlier in the week, but the man had canceled that morning. It felt like fate clearing the room. The cook was overwhelmed, and I offered to help prepare the stew. She barely looked at me, just waved me toward the counter. When no one was watching, I added the powder, just enough, not dramatic, not immediate. I didn't want a scene at the table. I wanted them to feel it later, in the quiet of their own rooms, when it was too late to do anything about it. We sat at dinner like any other night. Edward talked about expanding the plantation. The master nodded approvingly. The mistress complained about the servants. I forced myself to eat a small portion I had prepared separately earlier. I kept my face calm, my voice steady. If they noticed anything unusual, they didn't show it. The first signs came an hour later. The mistress excused herself, complaining of dizziness. The master followed soon after, looking pale. Edward tried to brush it off as spoiled food, but I saw fear flicker across his face when he began to feel it too. By midnight, the house was in chaos. Servants running back and forth, doors slamming, groans echoing down the hall. I stayed in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a fist. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't triumphant. I was terrified, not of them, but of what I had become. By morning, the house was silent. The doctor who arrived later that day declared it a sudden illness, food poisoning, perhaps something unfortunate, tragic, but not suspicious. I had been careful. There was no evidence, no reason to point a finger at me. As the only surviving member of the immediate household, and legally Edward's wife, I inherited more than anyone ever expected. The estate didn't automatically grant me freedom in the eyes of the law, but it gave me leverage. There were distant relatives who contested it, of course, but none had lived in the house. None had cared for Edward as his wife. The paperwork, as twisted as it was, worked in my favor. Within months, I sold the majority of the property. I freed every person who had been enslaved there, using the legal authority I now held. Some of them looked at me with confusion, others with gratitude, a few with suspicion. I didn't blame them. They didn't know what I had done. They only knew the family was gone. I left that town before my pregnancy began to show. I traveled far, to a place where no one knew my name. I gave birth to a daughter in a small cottage by the sea. When I held her for the first time, I cried, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but out of relief. She would never know chains. She would never be owned. Do I think about that night? Every single day. I think about Edward's laugh, the mistress's cold smile, the master's indifferent gaze. I think about the choice I made and the lives I ended. I won't pretend it doesn't weigh on me. It does. There are nights I wake up sweating, hearing echoes of that chaotic evening. But then I look at my daughter. I watch her run freely along the shore, her laughter carried by the wind. And I know that if I had done nothing, she would have been born into the same nightmare I escaped. My actions were dark. There's no denying that. But they were born from desperation, from survival, from a mother's refusal to let history repeat itself. So tell me now, after hearing everything, was I a monster? Or was I a woman pushed so far that the only way out was through fire? Like this video if you were on my side. Or even if you're still unsure, but understand why I felt trapped. Subscribe for more stories like this, where the lines between right and wrong aren't always clear. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I read more of them than you think. I'll see you all in the next story.